Welcome everyone. It's Doug Willms from the University of New Brunswick here. I'm broadcasting from the offices of the Learning Bar. And I understand there are people from right across the country and from every province and every territory, as well as some people from abroad. I'm going to talk about student engagement in Canadian schools as really as a backdrop to the new report that's being released by the Learning Bar. It's a thematic report on student engagement. As a researcher, I'm really excited about this endeavor of the Learning Bar as it brings together over 10 years of academic research with data on individual schools in a report that can affect change in Canadian schools. In a sense, it's like rolling out 100 different publications, but all with a common base. I really see it as a new way of knowledge dissemination. Oops, my thing's not going down. Don't tell me. Sorry, we're having a little technical glitch here. I wonder why that's not moving. Oh, there we go. Student engagement is a disposition towards learning, working with others, and functioning in a social institution. Many employers see student engagement as, in many ways, more important than academic achievement. We want students who graduate to have good academic skills, but they really want them to be able to work well as part of a team and work within their organizations. Engagement and learning go hand in hand. Engagement begets learning, and learning begets engagement. Quite often in the literature, engagement is really just seen as another one of those explanatory variables that drives learning, but it's also learning drives engagement. None of my presentations are complete without at least one socioeconomic gradient or profile. This is what we call a school profile, and it's based on PISA data. What we have here is a scatter plot of students' average level of reading proficiency on the y-axis, and I'll just tell you a little bit about that axis. The reading scores in PISA, first of all, PISA is the Program of International Student Assessment conducted by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And the PISA reading scores have an average of 500 for all students in OECD countries, and the standard deviation is 100, which means that about 2/3 of all students would have a score between 400 and 600, and about 95% of all students would have scores between 300 and 700. That's the y-axis. We also talk about reading in terms of levels, level 1, level 2, level 3. And in Canada, getting above the level 2 threshold is important because students who don't achieve higher than level 2 typically don't have many opportunities to go on to post-secondary education. And then we also know that students who do not get above level 1 are quite often have trouble finding employment after school and can suffer anxiety, depression, and so on as they try to enter the workforce. So that's the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have a measure of socioeconomic status, which in this case I've set to be 0 for all Canadian schools. So there's 0 is the average socioeconomic status, and again a standard deviation of 1. So most students would fall between, about 2/3 of students would fall between -1 and +1, and 95% of students would fall between -2 and +2. The dots in this case are schools. So here's a school with average socioeconomic status and relatively low scores. Its average score of the students is about 425. And what I've been really working on since really the beginning of my career is asking the question, if you have a school with average intake, why do some schools score down here and other schools score up there at the top of the band? And that difference, it doesn't look that big on the graph here, but it actually represents almost 2 full grade levels. So it really is an important question. And so what the Learning Bar has really been trying to do is develop good measures of things that drive student achievement, drive student engagement, but also position student engagement and wellness as part of that picture of what schools are doing and what school districts are doing. Just a reminder, when we look at international test scores such as PISA scores or the math scores from TIMSS, Trends in International Math and Science, these are the cumulative result of children's learning at home and at school since birth, or arguably even earlier. Quite often we think, oh, it's what PISA is to do with high schools or TIMSS to do with middle schools, but it's really not the case. It's a cumulative result of children's learning. When we've developed these studies, we use a model that was originally developed by Carroll and then modified by Slavin. We have our own rendition of this model, which says learning is a function of classroom and school context, quality instruction, learning time, and engagement. And as I said, learning begets engagement, and engagement begets learning. So one could turn this model around and say engagement is a function of classroom and school context, quality instruction, learning time, and learning. So this dynamic interplay, or you could say an interactive process, it begins early. It begins during the primary grades or even earlier and continues through to adulthood. Originally, I worked with the OECD as part of the PISA team to develop a report on student engagement. When we were developing PISA, we were successful in getting measures of sense of belonging at school, valuing schooling outcomes, and attendance into the PISA survey. But there was never really enough and never quite fully satisfied. And eventually we worked with the Canadian Education Association and developed a much fuller model. It includes social engagement, and social engagement has to do with students' meaningful participation in the life of the school. So it includes sense of belonging at school, but we also look at participation in sports and clubs and positive friendships at school. Institutional engagement refers to students' active participation in the requirements for school success, or we might say that students do school. They attend classes on time, they do their homework, and they know schooling's important, they value schooling outcomes, but they're not really intellectually engaged. And it was really through the work with the Canadian Education Association that we developed these measures of intellectual engagement, which entails a serious emotional and cognitive investment in learning. So with intellectual engagement, we're interested in students' interest and motivation in their school subjects, the effort they put towards their studies, and that works dynamically with quality instruction. In the learning bar, we have three aspects of quality instruction: relevance, rigor, and teachers making effective use of learning time. So I'm just going to show you some results for what you would say engaged students. On each of those measures that I showed you in our framework, we develop a scale. We go through rigorous testing to make sure all the scales are reliable. Each one of those measures typically has 5 or 6 questions underlying them. And we set a cut point to say, yes, this child does have a positive sense of belonging at school or does not. Or this child is participating in clubs and sports or is not, and so on. So when we look at engaged students then, we want to say what percentage of students are engaged in the various measures. And so as I mentioned earlier, this was conducted by was part of a study conducted by the Canadian Education Association in collaboration with Galileo Educational Network in Alberta and the Learning Bar. And when we conducted the study, we found that all 3 types of engagement markedly decline as students progress through middle and secondary school. For example, in the CEA study, in grade 6, about 60% of students were considered to be intellectually engaged, but by grade 9, the percentage was about 30%. Here's some examples from a recent study that we've done in one province showing the trend for sense of belonging by sex and grade. And this really mirrors what we also found in the CEA study. You can see that at grade 7, roughly about 77% of students have a positive sense of belonging at school, and that's comparable for both boys and girls. But then it gradually declines through to grade 12, maybe a little bit of a move up for girls at the end, but generally the trend is down, not a strong downward trend. Participation in sports and clubs, there you can see a very dramatic drop from in around 80% in the middle school years down to about 50% by grade 12. And especially you see the drop in the transition there from grade 8 to grade 9, grade 9 to grade 10. Positive relationships at school by sex and grade. Here there are some very definite gender differences, and in this particular measure you don't see a decline as students are making their way through school. Valuing schooling outcomes by sex and grade. Students having the sense that what they're doing at school is going to be useful to their future, and that getting good grades and graduation is important. Attendance by sex and grade. The Learning Bar's measure of attendance isn't simply our students truant or not. It also includes measures of whether students are skipping classes without a reason, or sometimes skipping whole days without a reason, or being late for classes. So we have a composite measure, and on this composite measure you can see quite a sharp decline from grade 7 through to grade 12. Positive homework behavior also declines, and we also, not shown here, but we also have a measure of the number of hours students spend doing homework, and that too declines surprisingly. And then you see a small uptake in grade 12. Interest and motivation also falling. Student effort also falling, a little bit higher for girls than for boys. And there's the measure of quality instruction, where students in middle school have much more positive views of the instruction they're receiving in this case language arts, mathematics, and science combined. So in the new thematic report on student engagement, the report actually shows, discusses the framework and then shows how well the school is doing on each of the 9 measures that I just talked about. Here's an example of one of the charts done for one of the schools. We're also concerned about equality of engagement outcomes. The term equality refers to differences in social outcomes among subpopulations, such as the differences between students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. With the Tell Them From Me tools, one can look at differences between males and females. One can look at differences across grades. You can also look at differences between certain drill downs that are specified by the school, such as First Nations versus not First Nations students, immigrant students versus non-immigrant students, and so on. In the report, the thematic report, we show the equality for students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So we have a measure of socioeconomic status that was derived from students' reports of their educational and cultural possessions in the home, their parents' level of education, and whether they're living in a 2-parent family. Now here's an example of one of the charts in the thematic report. This one is to do with interest and motivation, and so we have a measure of what percentage of students were considered interested in motivation across 4 grade levels. This particular school we chose as a secondary school, so it just has grades 9 to 12. And you can see there that on this measure, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have much lower levels of interest and motivation than students from high socioeconomic backgrounds. And you can see how this changes. By grade 11, though, the students from middle and higher socioeconomic backgrounds are falling off, and then by grade 12, the lowest socioeconomic group has really fallen off, and these last two are still also staying quite low. So having that kind of data for a school enables the school staff to really look at what it is that they need to do about equity. And in this case, in grades 9 and 10, it's a question of bolstering interest and motivation amongst lower socioeconomic students. But in grades 11 and 12, it's really a story for everyone. Why is it that it's falling off so quickly? Let's say a little bit about the students who are disengaged. I quite like this photo because you don't know if this girl's daydreaming or if she's really thinking seriously, but given the title, we're going to say that she's daydreaming. But clearly the other students in the background are engaged. Students who are intellectually engaged are more likely to feel confident in their skills and challenged in their classes. Students who lack confidence in their skills are more than 1.5 times as likely to suffer anxiety problems during middle and secondary school. In our work, we've been using a model developed by Csikszentmihalyi, professor at the University of Chicago, who talked about this concept of flow, and those people who are artists and musicians know what is meant by Csikszentmihalyi's term. It's that sense that you're just so deeply engaged in something that you lose all track of time, and he describes it as that perfect confluence of having high skills and being appropriately challenged. So we've asked students about how they feel about their skills, and we also ask questions about their grades. And now in the Learning Bar framework, we're using students' reported grades in language arts, mathematics, and science as a measure of their skills. We also ask students the extent to which they're challenged in their classes in the same 3 subject areas. First of all, I'll just talk about the group in flow. We've got about 43% of Canadian students that are in flow. We've also got students who are high skills but low challenge, and Csikszentmihalyi calls this the boredom category. And I find it quite amazing that we've got 1/3 of Canadian students who are reporting that they're not adequately challenged in their classes and feel bored. Over on this side, the low skills group, we've got about 1/4 of Canadian students, and that matches the PISA results. We end up with about 1/4 of Canadian students who are in that red and yellow category, in other words, level 2 and lower. Remember, these are the students that do not have many opportunities to go on to post-secondary after finishing high school. So amongst those 25%, you've got 17% who are high anxiety and 7% suffering apathy. Some recent work that Lucia and Tremonti and I did for the Canadian Public Health Journal, we found that the group here, the high anxiety group, indeed have very high anxiety and high levels of depression as they're measured in the Learning Bar framework. This group here also has above average levels of anxiety and depression. I want to say just a little bit about some of the drivers of student outcomes. Remember, this is where I began my career in this business maybe 25 years ago. I was really interested in what kinds of factors brought about differences in school achievement. So after you strip away the effects of family background and you dig into schools and look at the things that really make a difference, there are 3 factors that have always stood out for me that cut across elementary school studies, secondary school studies. Same 3 factors emerge whether you're looking at high-income countries or low-income countries. And those are teacher-student relations, the extent which students feel respected by teachers and get along well with teachers, the learning climate, or one could be more specific and say the disciplinary climate of the classroom, and then teachers having high expectations for student success. Those 3 factors seem to characterize those skills that are, those schools that are have high levels of achievement compared with those that have low levels of achievement after you take account of students' family background. Work by Amy Werner at the University of Hawaii. She looked at students who are the so-called resilient students, students who are from poor backgrounds but succeeded despite the odds. And what she found with those students is, in almost every case, they had some advocate, someone at school that was looking out for them, or someone outside of school in the community that was taking an interest in their courses, taking an interest in their school progress, and so on. So these three factors here, alongside advocacy, along measures of quality of instruction, are really the important drivers. And I maybe underemphasize quality instruction. In fact, this is by far the most important factor, but it's also the one that's most difficult to measure, and certainly most difficult to measure in a school survey. But even as we're measuring it in the Tell Them From Me survey, we really find it's an important driver not only of students' grades, but also a driver of the three aspects of engagement. In our study in Alberta, we had a large study that's still proceeding called the Tell Them From Me project, measuring student engagement. We found that there were considerable differences among schools in their levels of engagement, and only some of this variation was attributable to students' family backgrounds. 5 school-level factors were consistently related to student engagement: quality instruction, teacher-student relations, classroom learning climate, teachers' expectation for success, and student advocacy. So in the new thematic report, you'll find the graph for one school where we compare each of those factors to the Canadian norm. And for each of those drivers of student outcomes, we measure them on a 10-point scale, and so we can see how well this school is doing compared with the Canadian norms. And this one's pretty close to Canadian norms, just slightly above on advocacy. And you'll notice also that advocacy is very low, and we've always been surprised by this, and we look at the measures and say, well, are they too stringent? We really don't feel they are. That we're always quite surprised at how few students really feel they have someone at school looking out for them. Let me just say a little bit about the role of school leaders in this process. The first thing that we need to do is monitor student engagement. When we look at levels of engagement across Canada, we'd say that in a typical school, about a quarter of students have low engagement. There are students that are low achievers, there's others that have behavior problems, and there are others that suffer anxiety and depression. The school leaders need to know who those students are and regularly monitor their process. I use the word check and connect, named after this well-known program for ameliorating school dropout developed in Minnesota. We also need to encourage staff to look for warning signs of student withdrawal. Because remember, when you think of those graphs, you've got high levels of engagement in grades 7 and 8, and then gradually it's waning. So there are signs when students are beginning to disengage from school. Second point, identify advocates for disengaged students. Disengaged students most often do not have an adult they can turn to for advice. Building a strong relationship with an adult at school is key to student engagement, and developing a long-term plan for student success is very important. It's interesting, we also have a number of modules in Tell Them From Me on risky behaviors. And in the case of drug use or smoking and alcohol, when students indicate that they are using either cigarettes or alcohol or drugs, we can probe them further and try to look at questions to see whether they're at a level of harmful use, and if so, whether they feel they're addicted. And when you get to the end of that road, if we ask students, who would you turn to get help overcoming addiction, and we ask whether it's the counselors or a teacher or parents or friends, the highest category is they say they would try to do it themselves, and that's quite sad in a way. Number 3, help students become affiliated with school through clubs, sports, volunteer activities, or other school events. Disengaged students tend to have a low participation in school activities, and when they are participating, it provides them a way for school staff to connect with students on a day-to-day basis, and also provides a means for them to develop positive friendships. 4, implement an intervention to build literacy skills. So we know from our work at the Learning Bar and also at UNB that when we follow kids right from when they enter school in kindergarten through to high school, that there's this critical transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And about 20 to 30% of students fall off track in the learning. They don't make that transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And we know that the students that don't make that transition successful, which they need to do usually around age 8 or 9, if they don't make that transition successfully by then, about 90% of them are struggling readers right through to high school. And you can imagine the psychological toll of going to school every day, and it's just getting harder and harder as you go along. So we need to build literacy. Building literacy skills is really much more important than subject matter content. So if you think of these students entering middle school or entering secondary school, and they still haven't learned to read well, it's very difficult to achieve any kind of engagement if they're still struggling readers. Number 5, check in daily with students that display behavior problems. We need to help them develop good strategies for problem solving, celebrate small successes, and help them develop positive friendships. 6, develop effective programs to deal with bullying, exclusion, and sexual harassment. School staff must be able to recognize different forms of bullying and be willing to step in when they observe a student being bullied. Positive school policies and practices to make it safe for students to report bullying when it occurs and ensure that there are clear consequences for bullying that are consistently enforced. Schools can help to equip students with appropriate strategies to deal with bullying. And that's just scratches the surface. There are some very good programs now for ameliorating bullying and sexual harassment in school. And finally, developing school-wide and individual interventions to help those suffering anxiety or depression. In the Learning Bar's framework, we give an indication of students that are suffering moderate levels of anxiety, moderate levels of depression, but also developing more severe levels. At the school level, we can equip students with the skills to develop emotional resilience through helping them develop positive friendships, coping with difficult situations, positive thinking, and resolving conflicts. For a small group of students that suffer anxiety and depression, well, mostly we see students begin to, the prevalence of students suffering anxiety increases quite quickly during the middle school years, and then anxiety typically precedes depression. You don't see students being depressed first and then anxious. It almost always goes the other way around. Those students who go from anxiety to moderate depression and eventually severe depression, most often those students would need professional help. So just to conclude, I would say student engagement needs to be considered an important schooling outcome in its own right, sitting alongside academic achievement as a key measure of student success. Thank you. And I'd be happy to take questions from the audience. Pardon me? Oh, and to do that, you need to type into the little box where it says chat there. Pardon me? Oh, sorry. I'm a bit new to this system here. Where it says questions. There we go. First question is an easy one. Will the PowerPoint be made available? We'll make the slides available as a PDF on the Learning Bar website. And in addition, the session has been recorded, so one can also share it with colleagues if you wish. A question that I get asked quite often is whether doing the Learning Bar surveys leads to higher school achievement. And what we've learned from tracking schools over the last 3 years is that, first of all, doing the survey in itself doesn't improve academic achievement. What has to happen is schools need to be proactive and react to what students are saying in the surveys. It seems like an obvious point, but people keep saying, well, does doing the Tell Them For Me really lead to student success? And the answer is yes, it does, if you actually get engaged. And what we found with the schools that have been using Tell Them For Me is that it takes really 3 years. It's usually after the second year that one starts to see an increase in student outcomes. Any further questions? Our survey setup is set up for doing the survey twice a year. Typically, we recommend that schools do the survey in the fall, after, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, to do the survey in October or November, and use it then for school planning during the school year. We call our surveys leading indicators rather than trailing indicators. A lot of surveys students do, the results don't get back to the school for several months later. In the case of Tell Them For Me, it's immediate. You get the results within a couple of days. And so school staff can then really use it to plan the year. Many schools then do the survey again in the spring, and what they're looking for is whether their interventions or their efforts have been successful in increasing student engagement or improving health and wellness, whether they're seeing increases in the drivers of student success. And then in addition, schools we've got a broad menu of measures, and so some schools might do one set of measures in the fall and a different set of measures in the spring, with perhaps a small core of measures that are measured at both time points. But typically twice a year is what we'd recommend. The question is there any evidence that the use of technology improves student engagement? We don't have a measure yet on students' use of technology in the student survey. We do in our teacher survey called Focus on Learning. There's a recent study out just the last week or so suggesting that the use of technology dramatically increases students' academic achievement. I think the results are not all in there yet. Certainly when we've studied it with PISA, I wrote a paper about 7 or 8 years ago, student engagement was not related to use of technology. It really depends on how it's used and whether it doesn't become just another activity that students are used to, like cutting and pasting from the blackboard, or cutting and pasting with technology can be just the same thing as taking notes from a blackboard. Technology really has to be used in a way that moves students from fact-finding and reporting of facts up to some of the higher level skills that are measured in a study like PISA. Next question. Do you depict differences between authentic and ritualistic types of engagement? Well, that's a little harder one. I think the distinction for me would be that middle category, which we call institutional engagement, the active participation in the requirements of school success. These are the students that do school. They're good students. They go to classes on time. They know schooling is important, but they're not really authentically engaged. And that's really what the direction that the CEA study, the Canadian Education Study, was pushing this endeavor to really look at a serious emotional and cognitive investment in learning, which I think you would call the authentic engagement. So that's the way we would characterize that difference between authentic and ritualistic. It's not just doing school, but it's actually being emotionally engaged. Will the elementary TTFM survey, grades 4 to 8, include an engagement domain in the future? It certainly can, and we have some aspects of it, but it could be spread out, and that, you know, it's certainly something we'd be happy to look at, try to do something in more depth. Next question, will surveying students twice a year lead to students disliking the survey? You know, at the very end of the survey, students have an opportunity to send an email to the CEO of the Learning Bar. And one of the most frequent complaints we get, or we could say questions rather than complaints, students will say, gee, I've done a lot of different surveys, and where does all this data go anyway? And we never hear back. The schools that do really well with Tell Them For Me is when they take what students are saying seriously, and you know, it's easy, for example, to go into the open-ended questions and really get a sense of what students are saying about their school. Once students know that what they're saying makes a difference, then I don't think they'll dislike the survey. We don't have a sense of that. We don't get a sense that they dislike it in terms of response rate or students not finishing the survey or anything like that. So, but what's all important is students are, you let students know that what they're saying is important to you. Are there any additional implications for First Nation students? Last year or the year before, we began providing a question on students could report whether or not they're First Nations. When we look across the measures of student engagement, First Nation students tend to score lower on several of the measures of engagement than non-First Nation students, except valuing schooling outcomes. They still value schooling outcomes and so on. So in a way, I wouldn't say that it's an additional implication in itself, except that one has to look at the context of First Nation students in their classroom and in their school, and consider how it fits also with their socioeconomic background and so on. But I would say that I wouldn't call it any additional implications, but one needs to be cognizant that quite often they're coming from an environment where school has not always been valued, and so just have to look at it in that broader context. Have you found same constructs in the, have you found some constructs in the TTFM survey correlate more strongly with achievement than others? I would say that homework behavior, effort, and quality instruction are three of the big ones. But on top of that, we also see the various engagement constructs relating to achievement as well. I'd have to pull up one of my reports to answer that more precisely. But certainly, effort and motivation and homework behaviors are important aspects of it. Question is, what is the correlation between drug and alcohol use with anxiety and depression? We haven't looked at that yet. but it's certainly a good suggestion to look at that. While I'm waiting for the next question, my sense is that, as I said, anxiety typically precedes depression, and then most often with students, the depression would precede alcohol and drug use. So it's not only the correlation, but one would want to look at the temporal relationship of how that happens. So am I understanding that there is a correlation between studies of resiliency and student engagement? Certainly we know that when we've done some analyses recently that we try to develop a typology of students using a technique called a statistical technique called cluster analysis, and certainly family background plays a role. When we use the term resiliency, it's about students who are succeeding despite the odds. When we look at the group of students who have very low academic skills, they fall into two categories, and the category that has the highest chances of success in terms of finishing high school, not having mental health issues, are the students that are more highly engaged. That work will be presented in the next thematic report, which will be on school completion. Have you collected any data on engagement of students with learning disabilities? At the moment, we don't have any. We don't have a measure of disability, whether it's intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities or physical disabilities, in the survey. We would like to. The challenge is trying to get a measure of disability that doesn't take 10 minutes of survey time, and yet is still a reliable and valid measure. But we are working on getting a measure of that. And I don't know per se of studies of engagement of students with learning disabilities. I suspect, though, that students who have learning disabilities who did not learn to read well by the end of grade 3 would certainly have engagement issues. How accurate are the mental health questions regarding anxiety and depression in Tell 'em For Me in terms of a reliable diagnostic for those medical/psychological conditions? We had a woman named Dr. Alexa Bagnall, who is a child psychiatrist at the IWK hospital in Halifax, help us develop these measures. They're very reliable at the aggregate level. In other words, our measures coincide well with other studies done on anxiety and depression. They would not be, the gold standard for diagnosis requires a health professional sitting down with a child and doing a more thorough examination. So in that sense, we're not trying to diagnose students and provide feedback at an individual level and say this child has severe problems. What we're trying to do is give a good indication at the school level or the district level of here's the prevalence of anxiety or depression in your school. And at that level, measures are very reliable, but they're not reliable as an individual diagnosis. You couldn't do that with just 6 or 7 questions on each of those topics. So does participation of extracurricular activities make for a better school atmosphere? And what about academic success? And the answer is yes, that extracurricular activities are related to student success. And you have to be careful here because it's quite often the students from higher socioeconomic backgrounds who are more likely to be involved in extracurricular activities, and those are the same students that are more likely to be involved in academic success. But even when we control for background, there still is a residual effect with associated with extracurricular activities. You know, what really discourages me when I see the dramatic decline in participation in sports and clubs as students make their way through school. And yet, on the other hand, there are some schools that, even though in the high school level it might be down to 50% or less, there are some schools that are able to have very high levels of school participation in clubs and sports. When I say high levels, up around 80% of their students being involved. Have you observed any schools who have improved engagement at grade 12 level through the use of tools such as Tell Them For Me? Yes, indeed we have, and we can see that in the studies that where we've tracked schools over time. And I want to say that it's not the tools of Tell Them For Me, it's school staff using the tools of Tell Them For Me and then doing something at the school, the kinds of things that I mentioned near the end of the webinar. Well, thank you very much, and that was a very rich set of questions, and I'm going to hang on to these and look at them as I work on the next report on school completion. Thank you very much.